outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the weekly review. You will notice that I am not Mr. Paul Hazard. He, in his infinite wisdom, has left me in charge and unsupervised this week. So I don't know how this will go, but I think we'll be fine. I think we'll be good. He's currently sunning his head in Morocco, I believe. So he will be back next week. Joining me this week, we have Leanne, Brent, and John, and we've got a lot on the agenda this morning. So before we get to it, I would like to remind you that this show is sponsored by John Catt, and we still have our lovely discount, which is JCTTR2425. And as it is the 1st of December today, it's getting into that holiday season. You might want to be thinking about the teacher in your life and maybe getting them some reading material or treating yourself. You might want to do that. So if you head to johncattbookshop.com, you can make use of that discount and have a look at the whole catalogue. There is so much for you to do, for you to look at, for you to read. So check it out. We also have Parentkind, who are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering a strong school-parent partnership, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour, and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education and visit parentkind.org to learn more. Right. So, lots to get through this morning, and today we're going to talk about a number of different things. But first up, daily abuse and violence towards support staff. Now, we talk about behaviour and teacher abuse a lot on Teachers Talk Radio. Generally, we've talked about it a lot on Weekly Review, but it was it was difficult reading this week from The Guardian when we discovered that daily abuse and violence, actually a lot of it is directed towards support staff. So a survey of over 7,000 Unison members revealed that 1 in 3 school support staff in England face verbal abuse daily, such as kicking, pushing and throwing objects. Most abuse comes from pupils, but occasionally involves parents and carers as well. There is also low pay and financial struggles, with many staff being paid in the region of £1,200 to £1,400 a month. And many struggle with cost of living, with 78% reporting difficulties paying their bills. There's also increased workload, with teachers relying on their support staff more and more. They also handle additional pastoral care, learning interventions, and tasks previously managed by specialised staff such as speech and language therapists. And this is exacerbated, of course, by funding challenges in schools. But the government has pledged to reintroduce a school support staff negotiating body to improve pay and conditions. However, current funding allocations are inadequate, making it unlikely schools can afford the necessary pay awards to address the staff and pay crisis. Now, Brent, I know you are a big advocate for support staff in classes. I know we've talked about this before, but was any of this surprising to you?
No, the only surprising thing is it's taking far too long for this to reach the surface. But then again, that's the irony of this, is that they are the forgotten ones in schools. And that is why this is not being prioritized, because by itself, if this was happening to senior leaders, then more would be done. And it is because they are most likely the working class. They're most likely people connected to the school. They're most likely from the local community. These are people who are connected in some ways to communities. I know that if I take my own example, our caterers, our cleaners, our midday supervisors are people who are long-standing within the community. I have one who's 37 years in the school, longer than most teachers. And they're the ones that put down the connections to the community. And they're the ones that grease the wheels. But also they're the ones that suffered most during COVID. They're the ones that have 2 and 3 jobs, sometimes in school. You know, the catering person is also the cleaner, who's also a midday supervisor. You get multiple jobs in schools, and they are backfilling those roles and being well out of their comfort zones. They're also front facing. They're also dealing with the children who are most difficult. They're also the people who are well overqualified sometimes, people with PGCEs, people with degree levels are working as teaching assistants and paid absolute peanuts. It's a joke the way that these people are treated. And I think the level of protection afforded to them is not acceptable. And I'm about to say something, I don't care if the unions sanction me for it, but the 3 unions, for instance, that are responsible for support staff take their money and do not represent them. It is high time that they allowed all the teaching unions, including the NEU and the ASUWT, who support staff and members, to get around the table. For too long, support staff have been an inconvenience. What does the TUC got anything to do with support staff in school? So I'm really sorry to say it. I do not think these people have been properly represented and fought for. I think unions are happy to take their money on this issue, but they're not happy to defend them. They are the forgotten people in our education system. And it's about time even us teachers, some schools now, have gone on strike. And it's great to see this, where the teaching staff have put their arm around the support staff and says, solidarity, it happens to you, it happens to us. And that is something I feel very passionate and strongly about, because there is not a pecking order in my school. There shouldn't be a pecking order in any school, and support staff should be treated as equals, not as people who are just, well, minions to be used and abused. And that is too unfortunate. That is what's happened in a lot of schools and education settings.
And Leanne, focusing in on just teaching assistants for a moment, do you feel that they are having to do more, that they are stretched too thinly? I mean, I know that we've kind of talked about, certainly in the past, like at primary, it's a different beast than perhaps in secondary. I don't know if you've noticed in the environment you're in that they are more stressed, they're taking on more, they're ill-equipped to take on more.
Yeah, I think with behaviour changing, and we've spoken about this a lot on TTR, and also primary being a kind of a jack of all trades kind of teaching profession, we expect a lot of them, and we don't seem to provide them with the training necessary. It's kind of like a lot is expected of teachers at the moment, you know, psychologist, social worker, family manager, finally teacher, and we're actually expecting the same of our TAs. Without kind of giving them the training or the knowledge to do it. And then I think we try to fly the flag for TAs, but I also, even harder than TAs are those, like Brent said, the lunchtime staff, you know, the people in the lunch hall. In some schools, lunchtime can be possibly the hardest time of the day to manage behaviour. And these poor lunch ladies are coming in and kind of seeing the worst of everything. And they need more support, I think, even than possibly our TAs. And I think, like Brent said, I have worked in schools as well, where the lunch ladies are people from within the community, and I think it makes a difference because they know the kids. And I'm sure, Brent, the lady in your school probably taught the children's parents and the children's grandparents, so there's a connection. There's probably respect is easier to come by because they see them within the community. They know the parents. They probably have dinner together on a Saturday. So, you know, that all comes down again to school community, I think, which is something that's been lost a little bit recently in primary and possibly in education in this country.
Yeah.
Oh, most definitely. And John, I mean, I'm sure you saw a lot of changes and a lot of sort of things happen over your career. But where do we go from here? How do we improve this? Because this situation can't continue. You know, the schools are more than their teachers and their leadership. It takes, you know, it does quite literally take a village.
Well, that's thank you for that, Lucy. I think that's a important context to place this in. First of all, though, before I address that, I'd just like to say I absolutely agree with what Brent said there about power and power relationships in schools and how they are a disregarded group and often aren't able to be their contribution isn't recognized. And also, I'd like to agree with Leanne that something has changed. That's what you asked me, Lucy, what's changed in my career? Well, this has changed. Early on in my career, I thought I quite envied the support staff. I was at a school that was carrying out quite a bold experiment. There were a lot of support staff in the school. I used to have 2 in my classroom at one time, one with a particular student who wouldn't have been in the class without someone with them, and another one to help me. And I was in the mid-80s. nervous teacher in a big comprehensive school, year 9, year 8, all those. And I was very glad of these older than me at the time, experienced people who knew the kids. Absolutely. Goodness me, they were a godsend. It got me through those years. And I envied them in one respect, because I thought there was a sort of joy in what they did. They used to say to me, "Oh, I couldn't be a teacher, John. I couldn't be a teacher. All that marking you have to do, all that preparation you have to do. We can build relationships with the kids. I just love the kids." And I thought, yeah, that's what I want. I want that as well. And it changed over the years. Definitely, Leanne, you're right. It changed. It became a job you didn't really want to do, I think. And as they diminished in number, and as Brent points out, became, kids would say to them, "You're not a real teacher. I don't have to listen to you." Goodness me, and things like that kind. So their status altered, I think. Why is that, Lucy? I think in a sense, schools and society, we haven't got time probably to talk about it, but we could talk for a long time about the things that changed in the world in which schools operate, and schools can't solve this themselves. We can't. We're in the catchment, we're in the society, and some of the things that happened in schools, the emphasis on exams, the competition between schools, the managerialism, and outside of schools, a society whose values, are reflected in the kids, and they see it. They're sponges. They pick up the world they're in and bring it into school. So that sounds very negative, doesn't it? Things ain't what they used to be, but probably things aren't what they used to be.
No, and I hope there are ways to move forward. I can see that Paul Foss has been in touch. Our 3 TAs have been told this week that their contracts and paid hours will change and will find themselves £5,000 worse off. Likely we will find ourselves with no TAs by the end of the year. Well, there you go. All due to lack of funding, and school have targeted them as easy targets. With rising behaviour issues, will be lost without them. Well, there you go. And JBL has also got in touch to say the best person at handling the most difficult teenagers in an AP school I supplied in was a TA who had 4 children of her own. She was brilliant and taught me so much. And often that's the way, isn't it? Often that I've certainly, as a young teacher, have found that, in some respects, the whichever teaching assistants or learning support I've had, they've been ingrained in the community for a long time. They know, this community inside out. They know how to handle various needs and difficulties and things like that. So we need to look after everybody in schools more than we have been. So thank you for your input on that.
What we're really saying, sorry, Lucy, what we're saying is we need to support the support staff better.
Absolutely.
That's my point. We need to, because they're our lifeline, and I think as teachers we need to make sure they're okay, because they look after us, we look after them. It's the oxygen mask thing as well, and I think a lot of schools need to do that, because they are sometimes the unsung heroes. I think that grease the wheels of schools, and we need them. And I think too often we can get a little bit bunkered. I think everything that's happened to us in teaching has been amplified for them. Pay and conditions, lack of respect. For them, it's just accentuately worse. So if we can empathize with the loss of our status, loss of our pay, and our terms and conditions. I'm magnanimous to say, as a teacher, I think TAs, support staff, have had it a lot worse because of the nature of their job. So I think something needs to be done, or else, as Paul was saying there, we will suffer as well. So we have a symbiotic relationship with our support staff and vice versa. And I think that's in our own interests, as well as the school and the kids as well, because that's what it comes down to.
Oh, most definitely. Well, thank you for that. As you say, we could talk for hours and hours about this, but we do need to move on to our next story, which is all about... So up next, I wanted to talk about climate change and education. Now, COP29 actually happened last week in, I believe, Baku in Azerbaijan. Interesting choice, but there you go. And one of the key agendas was climate change and its impact on education. So there has been an urgent call for climate action, highlighting the severe impacts of the climate crisis on students' right to education and teachers' labour right. These include extreme classroom temperatures, which I don't think impacts you so much. Well, mind you, in the UK, it can in the summer, can't it? Definitely. I was going to say that's probably... it has been very hot in classrooms in the past. Water shortages and increasing natural disasters. Education International has emphasized the need for climate resilient education systems and integration of education into climate strategies. Workers and unions demand ambitious commitments to climate finance, emphasizing the implementation of the Just Transition Work Programme. Education International and unions advocate for a $100 billion annual pledge and avoid solutions that exacerbate poverty or depend on profit-driven private finance. Financing must prioritize loss, damage, and adaptation. It calls for comprehensive investment in high-quality climate education, including updated curriculum, teacher training, and facilities. And policymakers must recognize education's role in mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience. And there's also a lot about teacher advocacy here, making sure that we are in the position to be able to teach in extreme circumstances. So, John, do you think that this is perhaps overdue, given that the world is getting warmer, given that we are experiencing more extreme weather, particularly with the snow? I know last week in the UK, I know many schools had to close at short notice, with teachers having to go back to teaching online again.
Yeah, we are actually, Lucy, you're right. We are living at the beginnings of experiencing, looking out of our windows and looking on the television and seeing the climate crisis unfolding, and it's the beginnings of it. Unfortunately, our children and grandchildren will see the true consequences. I read this and I thought, well, if you stopped me outside of, coming out of Sainsbury's, and I was caught by surprise, and someone asked me in the street, what do you think about the impact of climate change over the next few decades on education, particularly in developing and poorer countries, I would have said, hopefully, something like this. If I'd been given a moment to think about it, I said, well, it's going to be bad, I'd have thought. Bad on a lot of the consequences will unfold in a very unpleasant sort of way for us and others. And as always in human history, the poor will, suffer the consequences more than others in our country and definitely across the globe. So this, in a sense, this reminded me, not that I did, I agreed with every word it said. Absolutely, I agree with this. But I agreed with it in the sense that teachers will recognize, probably, having gone on those kind of inset days where you are split up into groups and you're sent off to look at some aspect of the school, and you go into a room and you write things down on a big bit of paper and someone's got to report back. You actually spend about an hour complaining about the management, lamenting why you're not in your classroom doing the marking and doing all that stuff you needed to catch up with. And then you come back and someone plays the game and reads out 10 good things we all agree on, nice truisms about this particular topic you've been given, and everyone nods sagely and says, yes, you can't disagree with any of that, can you? You can't disagree with any of this, unfortunately. The truth, I would guess, I hope I'm wrong, that over the next couple of generations, after us probably, it will get a lot worse. There won't be a big transfer of wealth from north to south in this world. There won't be a just transition. It will be a very unjust transition. It will be a disaster. It's unfolding in front of us now. It will get a whole lot worse. And if we're lucky, as human beings face the nasty, appalling consequences, and some of it foreseen and some of it unforeseen, of the Industrial Revolution and so on, they will respond. It won't happen before then. No democracy will vote for reducing their living standards in the face of a crisis until it threatens their lives, unfortunately. That's the nature of us humans. But I couldn't disagree with a word this said. It's great. Yeah, do that. But they won't.
And sort of coming back down, Brent, slightly from sort of the wider issue. Why aren't we talking about this more in schools? I mean, certainly, I'm just thinking about the snow in the UK recently, the flooding in Spain, which has definitely, there were definitely school closures on the back of that. I mean, extreme heat in the summer, where we all kind of whinge and moan about it, and we all kind of, get show content out of it on TTR and things like that. But we're almost sort of still at the stage where we're kind of joking about this. We're not really taking it seriously in schools.
Worse than that, there's a lot of disinformation and pushback on net zero green agenda, and even now our curriculum, which I think is starting to reflect that, geography, science, etc. I've been teaching that for 20 odd years as a geography teacher, but there's now that massive pushback. I saw this morning, for instance, misinformation of contrails. It's the latest one. Again, a child saying to me, "Oh, weather controls, climate change is not happening. It's a conspiracy." So there's dark forces at foot trying to force, you know, the lack of change, because change will scare some people. And of course, there are far too many making money out of, hence Baku for climate change. Seriously, you know, let's have the vegan convention in a KFC and be done with it. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. So what we have is a disconnect between the reality and what we should be teaching our children. And you often get that in schools. We'd have our curriculum, which is saying climate change is happening, and you look up the lights, and the lights aren't, you know, halogen, because they're old, cheap, nasty, whatever you can get cheapest. Our schools are running on cheap budgets. And yet when you're building a new school, are they built to the pacifist standard? Are they built to a future-proof standard? Are they built to withstand, for instance, the temperatures? I was in school 2 years ago, July 2022, and we reached temperatures of 40 degrees in the UK. Oh. We had 3 classrooms that you could survive in. The rest were facing south and were greenhouses. And we had to rotate. We had to send children home, and we had to rotate classes that were fit to be taught in. And I wonder if, for instance, examinations, we examine children in June, you know, around June time, when it's absolutely stonkingly hot. We saw during the COVID crisis, the lack of ventilation in schools. I mean, the Conservative government was talking about opening a window. Wow, world-class ventilation systems. Germany was doing world-class ventilation systems. But here's a vicious loop. Well, we'll put air conditioning in schools, but air conditioning is extremely expensive and extremely polluting. So your solutions need to be sustainable. They need to be practical. They need to be modeling what we want our children to model. And frankly, we are failing because the powers that be are too busy in the short term. Much like the education itself, I think that there's a very strong sort of parallel irony between the way that education systems are run with short-termism and kind of the election cycle, whereas the same comes with climate change. They aren't thinking long-term strategic. They're thinking of themselves. They're thinking of their profits. They're thinking of, same as exam results. They're only thinking about the exam results, not thinking about the long-term implications on our children. So the two things for me go hand in hand. We need strategic planning. We need people in power that aren't driven by their own base instinct, greed, and that are altruistically motivated towards the betterment of everybody, not the enrichment of a minority. And that it seems to be is what you see, because the children who suffer the most will happen to be children from disadvantaged areas whose buildings aren't really very good, and they will miss more school days as a result of not being able to go into school because the heating is broke, because the snow day is closed, because they don't have the resilience. They don't have the resilience in those communities, and they don't have the resilience in the school buildings or their budgets. So again, you will find that as climate change kicks in, children from more affluent backgrounds will have workarounds, they'll have systems in place, where children from disadvantaged backgrounds will exponentially be suffering, as it mirrors exactly what happens in the real world, because there's always the poorest and there's always the disadvantaged who suffer the most, while the wealthiest will run to the hills and protect themselves.
Yep.
Yes.
And yes, I was just worried about your blood pressure there, Brent, for a second. But
it is something I do feel very strongly about.
No, and I knew you would, and that's why I'm glad that you're here.
Yeah. Brent, I think you added a bit of climate warming there yourself.
Yes, yeah. And Leanne, coming to teachers on this, how can we? Because teachers are obviously going to be a big part of this. How do we support them? Where do they fit in? Where's their kind of, because yes, we're sort of advocating for more education in terms of sustainability, in terms of things like that. Yes, we're sort of talking about schools as a whole, but what about the teachers themselves? Are they getting any training? How should this work?
Yeah, what about the teachers? You know, like it snows now and we do online learning, so that's not a snow day. That's changed. That's possibly why children have changed. Things like that have impacted it. And when reading about the conference, the one thing that stood out to me, it says the Education International Leadership urged governments. Well, let's not talk about governments and education, but okay. Governments to ensure that education systems are climate resilient. So I think it's misworded, and they need to put that teachers are climate resilient. Because whatever is put in place, who's going to have to deliver it? Not governments. Yeah, you can all put your hands up if you're listening. It's going to be you. Yeah, it's going to be us that are going to have to deliver it, and not just us. I mean, teachers all around the world. Thankfully, in England, we don't suffer too much, as opposed to other countries where maybe they're more prone to droughts and floods and hurricanes. but it's going to be the teachers of the world that are going to need to be resilient to teach in these environments. And it just seems like another weight to put onto the pile of teaching that is already overflowing.
Yep.
And onto the TA as well. The teaching assistant, as we mentioned before, is going to be something else added onto them.
Yeah.
There is one example where I can see where the political system again is interfering what should be done. The natural history GCSE was due to be implemented. That was fought for by a coalition of cross-party. Yes, it was eventually sort of put in place by the Conservative government. It was actually Caroline Lucas of the Greens who came up with that, and supported by members of the House of Lords. So it was cross-party. And already this government's now thinking, well, do we want to do that? Do we want to do that? That's the old government. And that is the problem sometimes. They're too busy playing politics, and they're not busy enough coming together and actually sitting down and going, what is best for everybody? They're too busy scoring points, and we just can't afford for them to score points any longer. Our children's future is far too precious. My own children's future, the children we teach future. And they often say we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children, and we are not doing enough. And future generations will damn us for this, and they'll wonder why weren't we taught at schools when there is a facility to do that. But we can only do so much as educators, but we can model good behavior, plant trees, model good behavior around schools, get our caretakers. I've done a lot of soft stuff like that, like putting foil on the windows to keep the temperatures down, and some small cost things like that can be very, very good. And again, you got to, I suppose, adapt is the key thing. But John's original point, mankind has always had the ability to adapt and change. It's what actually has driven us. Climate change is one of the reasons why we left the Rift Valley. It's actually one of the key things that has driven our evolution, is the ability to adapt and change. But if we end up adapting and changing any longer, then that's one of the reasons why we could find ourselves as a species in serious trouble, because we have to be able to. And one of the people who I think are able to adapt and change are teachers, which is Leanne's point as well. So I think we can be drivers of this, because we have always been able to adapt, change what we do in the classroom, and we're always reflecting. So I think we could be the leaders of the future educators, because we have that ability to, I think, adapt and change, whereas others seem to be dragging their heels.
I think Brent's right, and you get it sometimes in industry with management teams, that you have an old management team made changes, new management team comes in, they make changes, but basically it changes back to what it was before. And I think you get that in management teams. We're getting that in government. We've had a new government, and already there's a curriculum review in place. So it's like making your mark, but are they making their mark for the right reasons, or kind of just to be seen to have made a mark?
Very, very, very valid point. And I think that we'll definitely be coming back to this. Yeah, there'll be further conversations on this. Okay, thank you for your thoughts on that. On to our final story. So the next story caught my eye, and it's about representation in children's books. And the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education has done a survey recently and has noted a significant decrease in representation in the percentage of racially minoritized characters in children's books from 30% in 2022 to 17% in 2023. Excuse me. Similarly, racially minoritized main characters halved from 14% to 7%. There's declines across text types. Fiction saw the most significant drop, with representation decreasing from 24% in 2022 to 11% in 2023. Non-fiction also fell from 30% to 22%, while picture books maintained the highest representation, increasing slightly from 52% to 55%. Despite these figures, there has been an improvement from when the survey started, which was started at 4% reported in 2017. However, the drop highlights the fragility of recent progress. Of course, there's been call for industry action. They highlight that the diverse stories enrich literacy culture and can bring commercial and reputational benefits to the industry. And there needs to be ongoing advocacy. And it highlights the need for collective efforts to ensure representative literature becomes an integrated and permanent feature of the children's book industry. Now, Leanne, as a fellow primary teacher, I'd just be interested to know, actually, initially, what your thoughts are on this survey, and maybe some insight into why there has started to be a decline again in representation across children's books.
I know it's interesting that there's been a decline, because I think from my practice that in the past 5 or so years, there's been more of a push to have a bigger variety of characters represented in your English curriculum, in the literature that you choose. I was thinking about this before the show, and I also wonder if there are a lot of theme weeks throughout the year. Black History Month, for example, is a big one, where ever since I've been teaching, there's been a conversation of it shouldn't just be 1 month of the year. These things need to be represented throughout the year. So it just makes you wonder if, do those months become like a standing event in school, when actually it should be something that is weaved throughout people's curriculums for the whole year.
Yeah, oh, most definitely. And excuse me, my voice seems to be croaking in and out today, which is unfortunate. I don't know why. And John, I mean, do you?
Right,
Sorry,
yeah.
Dan, go ahead.
I also think that was it true in the data that you see it more in picture books than in anything else? And the higher you go in education, the less you see picture books.
Well, of course, yeah,
Hmm.
which is a shame actually, but that's another conversation. I mean, John, in your time teaching, have you noticed anything in particular? I know I always kind of ask you questions like this, but I think it is a good kind of litmus test to sort of see, what the changes that have happened.
Yes. What was it like just after the last ice age when back then? Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that, because it was
When the climate was cooler.
it was a lot colder. I can, as a kid, not as a teacher, remember the 1970s and the 80s, and things were really, really different. And if there's anything, I was being very discouraged by climate change awareness and how we might deal with it and so on earlier. But one of the good things I think I've experienced in my life is dramatic changes in attitudes among children, among young people, and hopefully in society. And of course, the young do it first in a way. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on in schools you might not like, but one of the things I saw was a greater tolerance among young people to things like gender diversity, use of the word gay, not in recognizing that it shouldn't be used pejoratively, and so on. And goodness me, we do live in a dramatically changed world to the one I was when I was young, in terms of social attitudes and prejudices and so on. However, I can also recall saying, and I was definitely wrong about this, and I remember saying it, that children, very young children, are colorblind. They don't see it. Well, they do, unfortunately. They do it very early on, and children are socialized quite quickly into the prejudices they find around them in society. So we do need school books and a curriculum and a society generally that reflects the increasingly diverse nature of our population and society. And otherwise, the sorts of changes I saw will take an awful long time. There are all sorts of ways in which we're a better society, but we're also saturated in all sorts of racial prejudices and unconscious biases and so on that exhibit themselves, unfortunately, not as much as the 70s, not as overtly as the 70s and 80s, but they're still there. And so, yes, hopefully this reduction in representation is a blip, and the trend is still.
I hope so too. And of course, we are all aware of certain books that definitely have not aged well. Enid Blyton, looking at you, where there's also debate about whether these books should be still available in libraries and should still be allowed in schools. I mean, that's probably another conversation for another time. But Brent, I want to come to you because obviously, I mean, as well as being a geography teacher, you're also a history teacher, and I'm sure and a lot of the theme months that we have throughout the year, or theme weeks, are kind of historically based. And I'm just wondering sort of how you feel about this data, and how you, maybe as a secondary teacher, sort of weave these things into your teaching.
That's exactly the point. I don't buy into the whole tokenism or themed months. So, for instance, when I'm teaching the First World War, I'd look at the Commonwealth troops, I'd look at the Caribbean troops, or World War II, I'd look at the Nepal Gurkhas and the Chindits. So I'll weave in where, I think diversity. So looking at for instance, the Romans, I look at the fact that the Romans had, soldiers coming across the whole Roman Empire, including African corps. So there was people of color in this country 2,000 years ago, not up till, it seems start with the Black Tudors seems to be the flavor of the month. Oh, did you know that they had black minstrels at the time of the Tudors? You have to avoid tokenism. Our children need to see the curriculum reflected in themselves and that diversity. However, there is a pushback. And I wonder, is there some self-censoring going on? Because I know, for instance, a school teacher, a rather controversial one, who was constantly on social media saying, look at this advert. This advert has a mixed race couple. What's happened to having just a white only couple? There are forces working against these culture wars, this stuff that we see coming in from America. And education is now, how you say it, constantly serialized. And teachers are one mistake away from making themselves into one of the tabloid press as a woke teacher. So there are dark forces pushing us back and trying to push us back. So there's two things happening here. We're trying to reflect society, but everybody's become so opinionated, polarized, so to speak. And every sort of literature choice you have now is constantly scrutinized. Even Ofsted, why am I teaching this? Why am I teaching that? And I have to then look at my curriculum and say, well, I'm teaching this because I'm teaching about the soldiers of the empire, because this is part of British identity. And I'm looking at the classroom here, and I've got children across the British Empire. Therefore, I'm reflecting the British Empire at war. I'm not just reflecting the Tommies went off to war. I'm an Irishman, for God's sake. My ancestors went off to war in the First World War as well. Whereas that in the history textbooks, it was written out of the history textbooks. So there's always that narratives that need to be weaved in. But you're constantly having to justify your decisions. Why are you teaching them? And a lot of parents now on these online forums are constantly chipping away at some staff members who are saying, I don't want my child to be taught that. I don't want my child to be taught by that. And this is Americanization that you're seeing coming across the Atlantic, where in parts of Florida, they're banning 4,000 and 5,000 books in schools, including things like Harry Potter. Well, to be honest with you, J.K. Rowling is a bit of trouble herself, but it's the idea that we are living in almost a 1933-esque, book burning type scenario. And I think with the election of a certain individual across the pond, that may intensify. So we're going to be under more pressure to justify our choices that we are. And maybe these figures reflect that some people are playing it safe. Maybe they're playing it safe because they've been threatened. Maybe the governing body, maybe that's certain parents, but maybe that's the problem with us teachers now, is that we are one mistake away from being absolutely, completely destroyed by some tabloid press member who's just looking for a woke story. And I think that's possibly what might explain some of this. It's a bit sad. It's very, very sad if that is the case. But these are the pressures that we're under now these days, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I mean, some complex stories there. And I think, again, we say this almost every week. There is so much more we could go into in all of the things we have discussed today. And, you never know that there might be some shows related to the things we have talked about today. But thank you for all your insights on that. We are now going to move on to do our shows of the week. Okay, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Who am I going to pick on first? I think I'm going to pick on John first.
Well, I'll go for Dave's Late Show yesterday. And it was all things oracy, which is a big topic at the moment. And I thought, well, this is going to a very fascinating discussion with Gemma Molyneux and Matt Venton, two really well-informed guests, talking about something really topical. So this was great for any teacher to listen to. What they explained to me and to any listener was that, in a sense, oracy wasn't simply about confidence. It wasn't simply about being able to talk in a discursive way. It was about some kind of structure of learning, which was more than that. They talked about dialogic learning, in which the teacher can learn from the students learn from each other, and you have an atmosphere of dialogue in the school, in the classroom, in the way of learning. And I thought, well, yeah, I like that idea. I don't know if I did it, but I'd like it. And I learned a lot myself. Too late now for me, but hey.
Fantastic. Leanne, coming to you.
Mine was the late show with Catherine, was titled Teacher Professional Identities and Retention. And I think there's a lot of NQTs coming into the profession at the moment, and a lot of the opposite leaving the profession. So from both sides of the profession, I think it's a good listen. I think that people think that, you know, you should teach a certain way, but I think it's important to have your own style. And I think, yeah, as we all know, retention is a hot topic at the moment.
Most definitely. Brent.
Well, I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist John's sort of a show, because I saw the title and thought accent bias and linguistic discrimination. Oh yeah. Well, absolutely.
I thought of you, Brent. I thought of you as well.
Wasn't directed at you, Brent. Wasn't it?
No, but there were times I could absolutely completely relate. But one of the good things about Teachers Talk Radio is the guests that we get on sometimes are just those people that you think, wow, you know, that's like a university lecturer who's telling us exactly something very bespoke to education. And it was like just like sitting in a lecture hall and having, you know, someone of that depth talking about what I think is a very important thing for our children, but also a very important thing for us professionally and societally. And I think it is massively important. And I did pick up some tidbits about linguistic diversity and this idea of bias and linguistic bias against discrimination. And it is something that I have suffered from a lot, because some people can't discern my accent sometimes, and I will admit that I have multiple accents for multiple settings, and even to the point where the children sometimes remark that my classroom voice is very, very different to when I'm podcasting or on the radio. That I have a radio voice, and then I have a voice that I have speak to my parents with, which is beyond potty mouth. So there was times I was chuckling along thinking, this is absolutely brilliant, because it is one of those life skills, one of those things that I think should be taught to teacher trainers. And one of the things I discussed on Thursday night in our show was about voice and about shouting, but actually tone, pitch. I think we need to pull some teachers to one side and say, this is how we speak. This is how, if you want to be, you walk like a teacher, talk like a teacher, speak like a teacher. I think it's very important that our voices are our currency, and equally, some of us, like myself, have over the years been able to use our regional accents to our advantage, so to speak. However, come with some disadvantages as well, with stereotype and then prejudice and even discrimination. I have suffered from that. And even some parents, I had a parent recently say to me, my child can't understand you.
Yes.
What? And they were just using this as an excuse, and I pulled them up and says, please don't, I can understand your child can understand me. They're here at school to learn, not here at school to listen to the same people and the same voices in the global economy. And that's how I left at that. And it was one of those, I thought, I'm not putting up with that. I'm not putting up with that whatsoever. Your child can more than understand me. He could understand people from America when he's on his iPod and he's on his thing, listening to like and subscribe to somebody said Skippity, for God's sake. He could definitely understand me. The parent's face was kind of like, well, how do you know he's online games? They went, that's why he's addicted to online gaming and all those things he's on in Americans, and he can understand some American, he can understand me. So the end of conversation. Mic drop. I'm not putting up with that nonsense. I can understand Liverpool, I can understand Newcastle, I can understand Birmingham. People can understand my accent. It's the same when you go to America, when you get people saying, hey man, I can't understand you. Well, of course you can, because I speak too quickly apparently. So I always say to people, it's not a question of speaking quickly, it's a question of your brain not working quick enough to keep up with me.
And breathe. Right, and my turn. So I listened in to and was actually behind the scenes for your show this week, Brent, Education Tonight, where you had Christopher Vowles as your guest. So because he was standing in for Adam, and it was a two-parter. So part one was all about knife crime in schools and in and around the community, and how schools are part of tackling that, but not, it's not entirely down to them, that it needs to be more sort of a community-wide action. And then the second part, which you've already alluded to, was about teachers and shouting, really. And I actually developed two hashtags here, and you can decide which one you are. Are you team short and shouty? Brett, oh, wrong way, pointing wrong way. Or are you team moustached and mindful, like our very softly spoken Christopher Vowles? So you can decide on that one. You can listen back and let us know what you think. That is all for
Hashtag Shirley.
What was that, Brent?
Nothing. Sorry, you couldn't hear my accent.
Can I comment on JBL before we go? JBL's comment that came up down there. He said he must have taught in the United States, because he said something like the greatest asset I had was British accent. I taught in the States for a year. Absolutely. Goodness me, did I sound RP? Absolutely. The man from England. Really, accent? Do I have an accent?
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
Hollywood does that, doesn't it? Hollywood always has English actors put on a fake English accent. You think, why are they talking? Why is Tom Hiddleston talking like that? It's weird how they make them put on this kind of midway pronunciation. And the same goes for the Irish guys. You always get the worst Irish accents, like Jared Butler in P.S. I Love You. And we're like, oh no, don't do that. Or, you know, but my favorite's Brad Pitt in Devil's Own. I never meant to hurt your family, Mr. Ryan. And you're like, oh dear God, where did they get this from? And it's interesting that when I lived in America, they did want me to go to be sure, Shamrocks. And they couldn't figure out mine, no, because they expected me to be 32 and a third. I mean, people in England do it all the time. You're not Irish, you're Scottish, you're Australian, New Zealand, because they expect an Irish accent to be somebody from Dublin. And then they look at me because they don't realise that there's as many diversity accents in places like Ireland as there is in England.
Also, you don't really look like a leprechaun, so, you know.
Yes.
I am sure. I did convince, when I worked in the casino in Atlantic City, I did convince people my grandfather was a leprechaun. And I had magic powers. When they kept winning, I kept getting the stories I could tell you people, honest to goodness. The best ones when I convinced some people I was a dolphin trainer. And that didn't go very far when the girl realized that she was actually studying marine biology, was then telling me what type of species was it. And I'm only joking. You know, it's a bit of a joke, you know.
Right.
The stories we used to say is, well, you know, gift of the gab and all that. Hey, talking about a stereotype and using your accent. Thank you, John. That was a brilliant show, by the way. I really enjoyed that.
Right. Before we get derailed entirely and banned from air and banned from ever doing this show again, we are going to wrap up. And no, Brent, I'm not looking at you before you pull that face at me.
To be sure.
So thank you, as always, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to the panel for sharing their wonderful insights and thoughts and their shows of the week. Remember, if you want to listen back to anything or get in touch, we are, well, you can see at the bottom, we are at TT Radio Official. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, we're on everything, X, Blue Sky as well, which is fairly new for us, but we're getting there with that as well. So, fantastic show, everybody, and see you next week.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.